Hey everyone, thank you for listening in. I have as my guest here today Chris Date. And Chris is someone who I've really enjoyed interacting with, and I've admired particularly his work with Rethinking Hell, and I've enjoyed his podcast, The Apologetics, which is in need of an update, I think, Chris.
Yeah, I wouldn't hold your breath.
So, well, I mean, really quickly, part of the reason why we chose this film to discuss, or why I suggested it, What Dreams May Come, is because of its, reflection on issues of the afterlife, and that's been a sort of a specialty of yours. And would you mind giving a little bit of a backstory about kind of your focus on that area?
Yeah, I became a Christian when I was 20 years old, having formerly been an atheist and not having been raised in church or anything like that. When I became a Christian, though, having had extremely little exposure to Christianity in Christian circles, the one thing that I knew that as a Christian I needed to believe, or one of the few things anyway, was that hell is a place of eternal conscious torment. It was something that I must have imbibed from culture and from media and stuff like that. It's not at all the kind of thing that has to be actively taught you to believe by, in churches. It's just sort of, this is what the culture knows is official Christian teaching. And so I accepted that. And as I listened very early on to theologians and apologists and things like that, I continued to believe in this traditional view of hell and defended it, including against people like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. Mm-hmm. But when I began, or at some point during that podcast you mentioned, The Apologetics, which the reason I say I wouldn't hold your breath is just because I have so extremely little time to keep that up. But anyway, at one point I was doing ministry at another website as well with a mutual friend of ours named Glenn Peoples. Mm-hmm. And when I was discussing the issue of physicalism with him at the time, one of the texts that I raised...
And to clarify really quickly, physicalism is what exactly?
Yeah, so physicalism is a view of philosophy of mind. It contrasts with what would be called substance dualism, which is the view that human beings have a material body and an immaterial soul that typically is believed to remain conscious after death, whereas physicalism of the brand or variety that Glenn Peoples holds to is the view that human beings are physical creatures, that we do have minds, but those minds are sort of the product or effect of the functioning of our brains, such that when we die and our brains cease to function, we are no longer conscious. So when I was a dualist at the time and was ministering with Glenn at our friend Dee Dee Warren's The Preterist podcast and blog, and I was asking him about the implications of Matthew 10:28, where Jesus says, "Don't fear men who can kill the body but can't kill the soul. Rather fear God who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna." And I was sort of using that as an argument against physicalism. And he said, and I won't go into a discussion about physicalism here, but what he pointed out was the challenge that text posed to my view of hell at the time, which was eternal torment. And in the course of that discussion, I brought up Mark 9:48, where Jesus says, "Their worm shall not die and their fire shall not be quenched." And Glenn pointed out, well, yeah, but go look at what Jesus is quoting in Isaiah 66:24. And when I saw there that explicitly Isaiah says it's corpses that are being fed upon by corpses or by maggots and fire, and that the scene is one in which God's enemies have been slain and their dead bodies are sort of piled up and being consumed, that began to that caused me to begin to question whether this tradition that I had accepted when I became a Christian was in fact biblical. And so I began, never having any sort of inner turmoil or emotional objection or philosophical objection to this doctrine of hell. I began to question whether the exegesis of Scripture supported it. And so I began to research that. I interviewed Edward Fudge, author of The Fire That Consumes, on The Apologetics. And suffice it to say that over the course of several months, I became convinced, went on to defend conditional immortality or annihilationism in debates and on radio shows and stuff like that, joined up with a ministry that began at that time called Rethinking Hell. And, ever since then, I've been publishing articles and podcasts and books and speaking at conferences and so forth.
Well, and you even debated Al Mohler as well. You had an opportunity to do that, right?
Yeah, that was incredible. I really enjoyed that. Dr. Moeller is very smart, and he was very kind and respectful. And after the recording was over, he said he'd love to meet me sometime. But most listeners on either side, I think, of the debate would say that he did not come out the victor in that debate, and I suspect it has more to do with his lack of preparedness. I don't think he went into that debate expecting what it is that he encountered. I think a lot of defenders of the traditional view think that we conditionalists are soft-hearted, liberal sentimentalists, and that we just can't stomach the idea of eternal hell, and so we're just sort of trying to shoehorn our view into Scripture. But none of that is a fitting description of me. For me, it was about exegesis, and when I was responding to his attempted exegesis of texts, I just don't think he was prepared for that kind of conditionalist. But anyway, it was great interaction, and it's really opened a lot of people's eyes. I think I was thankful for it.
Oh yeah, I was very excited to discover it. I actually, for me, it was interacting with a friend who was a Seventh-day Adventist that got me open to Christianity, kind of in high school. Again, after I'd been an atheist through high school and junior high. So it didn't take me too long to discover Glenn Peoples, and then kind of ran into Rethinking Hell, and it's a tremendous resource for anybody who's interested in these issues of what does the afterlife consist of or not consist of, particularly for when it comes to final punishment.
Well, thank you. And I'll just add, given the nature of the film we're about to discuss, that it's not just the sort of bad news of the afterlife that I'm particularly interested in. It's also the good news and the heaven side of things. The very first episode that I did of The Apologetics was me explaining that what got me what caused me to decide to start blogging and podcasting was it occurred to me just how poor the understanding is of most Christians concerning heaven and concerning the eternal state and the resurrection. Most Christians, I suspect, lay Christians, uninformed Christians, if you ask them, about eternity, you'll probably hear nothing about resurrection. You'll probably get the impression that they believe in some sort of a disembodied spirits floating on clouds with harps kind of a view, and I'm very passionate, about that. And so this movie is an opportunity to discuss both the good and bad sides of the afterlife, and whether the views depicted in it are even remotely biblical.
Yeah, that absolutely, and I think that was why I thought you would be a good fit for this, because it's definitely an issue you've thought about a lot, and I think as we get into this, one thing that I sort of felt as I watched it was that what essentially is happening in this film is what you might call a midrash.
Midrash, okay.
Yeah, this movie felt to me like a midrash on, in some sense, traditional views of heaven and hell in Christianity. So it was interesting to see where they took it.
It's funny because I would use a word that it sounds like midrash. The word I would use is mishmash. It seemed to me to be just such a mishmash of all sorts of different views, and it lacked a lot of coherence in my view. But anyway, I mean, those
yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and so and anyway, I'll kind of quickly introduce the film. It was directed by a gentleman named Vincent Ward, who's actually directed a number of films over a number of years, but this was the only one that was very familiar to me. I did notice he was a writer on Alien 3, which is actually kind of interesting because that also dealt with a lot of spiritual and religious themes. So it seems like it's something that he thinks about. It's actually based on a novel by Richard Matheson, who is actually one of my favorite authors. He wrote not just a lot of books and short stories, but he wrote Twilight Zone episodes, a number of some of them which are my favorites. And I'd read this book when I was much younger, and he also wrote there's a Stir of Echoes, which was developed into a film with Kevin Bacon, and I Am Legend, which has been remade multiple times. And for my money, none of the film versions of that are anywhere near as good as the novella that he wrote. But so in the film we have a handful of central characters, just a few. There's the character of Chris, who's played by Robin Williams. His wife, Annie, who's played by Annabella Shora, I believe is how you pronounce her name. And so what is essentially happening in the film plot-wise, and we're going to spoil it a little bit here so we can actually discuss the issues raised in the film, is you have these two people that fall in love and have children together. The children die in a car accident and you see sort of through a series of flashbacks at different points in the movie that, the woman, the wife, the mother, deals with a lot of issues of depression and suicidal thoughts, and it almost destroys their marriage, but they work through it. And then he also dies. He's hit by a car. And so then he sort of, at this point, goes into the afterlife, experiences something like heaven, and is waiting eagerly for his wife to join him. But she commits suicide and winds up in hell, and he decides that he's going to try to go to hell to rescue her. I would say, just looking at the film from a technical aspect before we kind of look at some of the theological and philosophical themes, one thing that really stood out to me watching it was I thought the visual effects were beautiful. I think there were a lot of movies made around this time that really heavily relied on visual effects, and I don't think a lot of those films held up nearly as well as this one did. I don't know if you had any thoughts about the look of the film or its kind of aesthetic value.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, especially for the time. I think that its visual, its special effects were fantastic. It certainly is in particular, Chris's version of the afterlife, his special place in the afterlife, which is an issue that we'll get into, is stunningly beautiful. He's constructed in his afterlife basically a three-dimensional world that represents paintings that he and his wife loved when they were both alive, and so the surroundings are not only beautiful, the way that a rolling landscape with beautiful trees and mountains and rivers and waterfalls and things like that, but furthermore, all those things are made of paint, and so you have this sort of surreal Vanilla Sky kind of look to it, and it's stunning. I think I'm maybe a little bit of a product of my generation. I don't even know if that's even true, but I guess what I was going to say was, I'd love to see it done now, 20 years later. I think it could be done even more stunningly. And some of the things that, looking back, for example, you've got the scene where in his daughter's version of heaven, hopefully I'm not giving away too much right now, but these figures are floating up and down and flying up into the sky and stuff. And it just reminds me how poorly the special effect of people flying historically been able to be achieved. So, but anyway, those minor criticisms aside, yeah, it is beautiful. It is beautiful special effects, sure.
Yeah, I can see that. I remember. I want to say it's either Leonard Maltin or Roger Ebert who had said something to the effect of, in older films back before the advent of CGI and that kind of thing, the effects looked fake but felt real. Whereas, once you start having computer generated effects, you have effects that look real but feel fake.
That's a good way to put it.
And this is kind of an interesting film because you do have a little mixture of both. Not everything is completely computer generated, like is done now. And one thing that I felt of why the effects seem to work better in this film than, I know this is probably going to upset a lot of people, but like The Matrix, is that I didn't think the effects in this film were gratuitous.
Right.
They served a very specific purpose, and it was an aesthetic purpose. It wasn't necessarily like just to be over the top. And I think that gave them a sense of restraint. Whereas if you compare that to a film like Spawn, which came out around this time as well and was viewed as having really, amazing, mind-blowing special effects. And that film looked terrible. I mean, the hell scenes in Spawn are really awful now. But in this film, they work, at least in my opinion. And actually, there's little things too that aren't, have nothing to do with like CGI or whatever. Like Annie's makeup when Chris comes to visit her in hell, and when he's first talking to her, everything is grayed out, and it looks. I'm pretty sure it's a makeup effect because he seems to be more colorful, but her lips look gray, her face looks gray, and when she's maybe perhaps about to come out and sort of she's sort of getting out of the hell mentality.
Color starts to return.
Yeah, the color starts to turn. Her lips become a little more red, and so there's little things like that are subtle but work very well. I mean, it's very much an aesthetic film in my mind.
Yeah, and in fact, my wife told me that she thinks that it was the movie was intended to showcase special effects and visual effects more than to tell the story of the book. I don't know if she's right, but it certainly it does feature those kinds of really good special effects that you're describing. And you're right. On today, especially on the kinds of TV screens that we had 20 years ago. I watched it on my HD TV, and you could tell she's wearing makeup. You could even see slight little bits of color in the scene you're describing. But it's hardly noticeable, some 20 years later on an HD TV. So that that they did pretty well for the time.
Well, and actually, I mean, speaking of whether the film was really trying to explore the same themes as the book. It's been years since I've read it, but one point that sticks out to me is a plot point, and that's that in the book, the children aren't dead. And it felt to me that the reason the filmmakers chose to have the children die in the film was because it made Annie's choice to commit suicide seem more relatable or understandable.
Yeah.
And the feeling that I had was that, some people could read, so in the book, she's a mother who commits suicide over the loss of her husband, but her children are still around. And I think maybe there was a concern that she'd be less empathetic. People would feel like, your kids are still alive. Why are you know what I mean?
I think that's legitimate. My wife and I have said that if we've sometimes wondered how we would handle it if one of us were to pass, and both of us I think have felt we have to go on for our children's sake, as hard as that would be. So I think that might have been a wise decision on the part of the producers or writers. I mean,
well, it is interesting though, because it does raise issues of mental illness and how we relate to or understand or view people who are struggling with mental illness. And certainly what's kind of interesting is obviously in this afterlife, heaven and hell are creations of the mind in a large sense. But this is even, obviously even truer in a sense of Annie, because that's true of her life before she dies. It's, mental illness sometimes is a hell that your mind creates for you. And, she's obviously unhappy in this hell. She doesn't want to be there, but it's still a creation of her mind. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, aspect, I guess.
Sure.
So I don't know. So maybe it would be good to jump forward a little bit to some of these issues of the actual just specific kind of details portrayal of heaven and hell.
Well, even before that, I thought that, you mentioned this idea of the heaven and hell being creations of the mind. It's maybe before we start getting into heaven and hell specifically, we could talk about the question of philosophy of mind, which is, because we a few minutes ago I was describing my understanding of substance dualism versus physicalism, but there's also idealism. A friend of mine, Jim Spiegel, is a Christian idealist, and what struck me was it wasn't just heaven and hell that are the products of the mind. At one point, the afterlife manifestation of his son, played by Cuba Gooding Jr., says to Chris that the physical is the illusion, that what's true is what is in our minds.
Yeah, I think he specifically says thought is real.
Thought is real, exactly. So that sounds to me like idealism, but then at the same time, there are all these questions about souls, and human beings having souls. So it seemed to me to be, like you said, anti-physicalist. But whether it's a sort of a dualist or whether it's an idealist picture is an open question, or maybe it's sort of, like I said, a mishmash of both.
Well, and I think there's Chris even makes a comment in a flashback before he's dead, where he's talking to, I think, Annie, and says, "What's true in our minds is true."
Right.
And so yeah, there's definitely this strong aspect of reality being determined by our minds, and that's obviously, I guess, in a sense, more so in heaven and hell than it is on earth, but it still seems to be their viewpoint about Earth as well.
Yeah, and I think that also says something about, in terms of worldview, it's not only a view of philosophy of mind, it's arguably also a view of ethics. The movie seems to have little, if anything at all, to say about the morality or justice of actions. And so when he says what's true in our minds is true, I didn't take that merely as a sort of repudiation of a physicalism, but also a relativistic view of ethics. It's whatever I think is true is what's true for me, and whatever you think is true is what's true for you. So it's idea about thoughts being real and what's being true in our minds is true. Actually, I think touches on a number of different areas in philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and to kind of get into this idea of whether the film is supporting something like idealism or some kind of anti-physicalism, it brings to mind, obviously. So I'm not sure where I fall on the dualist or physicalism viewpoint, but I'm certainly not an idealist. And this idea that you sort of have, you're not a body having a spiritual experience, you're a spirit having a bodily experience or something like that, that what we really are is this non-physical part of ourselves. And that seems absolutely contradictory to the biblical viewpoint. And it also seems nonsensical, particularly at this point where we know so much about genetics and how much our physicality and what we inherit shapes who we are. I mean, when you think about it in those kinds of terms, it's hard to imagine what it is that is supposed to be really you that's not physical, because everything about yourself, even those things you think of as sort of distinct about you, are in some sense connected to your physical embodiment. At the very least, your genetics or your personality or whatever are sort of shaped in that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm just a little reluctant to say much about idealism because I got the impression from Jim Spiegel when I talked to him that what I think of as at least a Christian variation of idealism is not, it doesn't really reflect what it is that Christian idealists believe. So that's an area of study that I'd be interested in pursuing, just to find out what it is that they believe. I think that what they would want to say, Christian idealists anyway, is the fundamental reality that is thought, that is idea, is that of God. That's my guess. We are manifestations of God's creative thoughts, and that is our fundamental reality. And as you said, we're sort of experiencing a physical experience. But like I said, I'm not very familiar with the landscape there. So
sure, yeah, and I obviously I don't want to misrepresent someone else's viewpoint either. But in just thinking about the film itself and comparing that to what I see as the biblical worldview or viewpoint, in the biblical viewpoint or perspective, the physical world is not only good, but it's actually central to the restoration of all things that God is going to accomplish.
That's right.
And so I don't see anything like that in this film, which I think seems to be leaning on this idea that, oh, you're just a spirit having a physical experience. That who you really are is this spiritual part of your soul, part of yourself, or mind.
Yeah, and it raises other questions too. One of the things that struck me is that at least three characters in this afterlife, namely Chris's son, his and his wife's son, their daughter, and his mentor, they all manifest themselves ostensibly by choice in the afterlife as people other than who they actually are. And what strikes me about that is that not only does this seem to diminish the value of our physical embodiment, but it also seems to me to raise questions about the value of identity and reality. What is wrong? What is so wrong with a person's true identity that in their supposedly blissful afterlife they prefer to present themselves as somebody totally different? Now I know there are they address, why they present themselves differently to him, but see, that raises other questions as well that maybe we'll get into.
Yeah, well, actually, I think it might be a good time to bring that up now, which is, the reason that his at least the very least, his daughter and his son portray themselves differently is because they have experienced an imperfect love from their father that makes them insecure to be themselves. And that this whole idea in the film that Chris and Annie are soulmates, and that their bond is so deep that it sort of transcends. Well, I mean, obviously, I don't want to say that your relationship with your kids should be more important than your relationship with your spouse or something, but it's super. It abundantly it transcends the relationship with their kids, and it kind of brought to mind for me this idea that I've sort of heard explained that pure love requires that there be more than two parties. That romantic love, even though it seems other focused, is still very closed off and essentially kind of self-gratifying. And I've always thought that was an interesting argument for the Trinity in particular. But at the very least, it seems to be, if not explicit, kind of an implicit undercurrent in this film that their deep love for each other has, in some sense, left their kids in a unsatisfactory position. And it's also interesting about what it says about the afterlife that in contrast to the Christian viewpoint that God is going to wipe away every tear, there's a great deal of insecurity and sadness and weeping in heaven in this film. And that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. I'll touch on that in a second, but going back to their portrayal of themselves differently, it's interesting because I understood their reasons for doing that differently. I took the mentor's explanation as being the reason why all three of them presented themselves differently, which is that they didn't want their relationships in life, those relationships being mentor-student, father and son, and so forth, to unduly shape their interactions in this afterlife. And part of the reason why I lean towards that over the insecurity view is because even after their father, kind of wakes up to the reality that these are his children, and they reunite emotionally and everything, they continue to present themselves in that way. And I'm not sure what to make of that, but either way, the thing that I find interesting about that is, in fact, kind of what you're saying, which is there's something wrong about there's something imperfect about this afterlife, such that they've got to change how they present themselves to make it better. And the weeping thing was interesting. You're right. It is that there's so much sadness and insecurity and other things there. And this sort of gets to one of the arguments theologically or philosophically for our conditionalist understanding of hell. Look how much pain Chris undergoes knowing that his wife is suffering. How, as if we want to briefly touch on the theological aspects, how as Christians, how as redeemed people could we enjoy eternity knowing that our loved ones that didn't repent are suffering in hell? I find that to be a powerful challenge in light of the kinds of emotions experienced by the character Chris in this movie.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and obviously, I certainly wouldn't look at a lost loved one burning in hell forever in the same way that Tertullian would seem to argue that one of the great joys of heaven will be hearing the screaming cries of those who are burning in hell. Well, so I think one thing about I don't want to belabor a point too much, but the idea that sort of insecure in the love of their parents, there's a few lines that sort of stuck out for me. One where he's talking to his son, but he doesn't realize it's his son. The character of Cuba Gooding Jr.'s character. And he's defensive about his relationship with his wife. And he says, "You don't know us. And his son says, "I wish I did."
Yeah.
And so there, and actually, his son continues to take on the form of the Cuba Gooding Jr. character or whatever actor. I don't know, Visage in hell after because he's sort of in hell with his father to try to help find the mother. And when the father realizes who he is, he does continue to keep that form.
That's
right. But once he does bring his wife back and brings her into sort of his heaven, or their heaven, I guess, the son and daughter show up in their earthly forms.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I don't know. I wondered if there was sort of a reconciliation and an experience of love that happens in heaven when they're in these different forms. That maybe, and maybe I'm going too far to say that this had something to do with his imperfections as a father. But at the very least, they needed to be shown that his love was sincere and, unconditional before they were willing to take off these other sort of external images as a way of sort of buffering their relationship.
Yeah, I think that's very plausible. I mean, you definitely get, when his daughter appears to him as this flight attendant that she once saw him, not ogle, but remark on how Asian women are they have beauty and grace and stuff. She seems to. The impression you get is that she felt that he hadn't, that there was something lacking in his appreciation for her own beauty and grace and so forth. And similarly, this, I think you're right. The son, I think, sees this relationship that his dad had with his mentor as being the kind of relationship he'd like to have with his own dad or something like that. And so, yeah, there may be something to what you're saying. That raises another question for me, though, that I thought was interesting, which is that in this afterlife, when children die, they remain children in the afterlife, at least in their sort of true form, if you can use the word true. And so, for example, not only do they take their masks off, to use your language, and sort of by the end of the movie are comfortable just being themselves. Mind you, they're 4+ year olds, themselves from 4 years earlier. Mm-hmm. Right. So apparently there's no aging in the afterlife. So apparently when you die and you go into this afterlife, you remain at the age that you're at, if you're that young. I mean, you even had babies or toddlers in the in his daughter's version of the afterlife. I just thought that was interesting. If the physical is just an illusion, what reason would there be to continue appearing as a child once you're in this afterlife? I don't know. I just thought that was interesting.
Well, but actually, though, I don't know that it's ever stated that these toddlers in heaven are actually toddlers. For all we know, they could be 90-year-old men who are harkening back to a time when they were young and happy or something. And I think his wife actually asks him once they get to heaven, could we grow old here? And I think he says yes, because ultimately they can if they want to. It's because all of that is simply a matter of the mind.
Yeah, that's true. Although I don't think any of them would really want to grow old and with everything that growing old
sure
comes with. Yeah. I think so. I don't know. That's a good point. But see, and this raises yet another question, which is, it strikes me as strange that there's seemingly nothing wrong with going around and deceiving everybody, right? Because when you're appearing as people that you aren't really, you're appearing to people you know and people you don't as people that you actually aren't, and I just this goes back to what I said earlier, which is that the whole concept of there being value to what is real, not just what is physical, but what is real, seems to be really minimized, except for, and this was another interesting thing. I'm going off on all sorts of tangents. I apologize. I thought it was interesting how the concept of this afterlife, and the good side of it anyway, is that you create whatever reality you want, except for this city across the river where his daughter says there has to be some sort of a common vision. Mm-hmm. It strikes me as so bizarre. Why couldn't each person experience a different vision even when they're in one another's company? And why is the common vision like a first century Greek or Roman type of environment, very similar to the one in the what's it called, the mobile or whatever, the
that his daughter has.
That his daughter has, right? Exactly. So it's just really weird. That's one of the things I don't like about the message of this movie is it seems to diminish any sort of value in objective reality. It's all about whatever you want it to be, except in this arbitrarily chosen center of all reality. I don't know. It was
when you hear people talk about relativism and values, relativism isn't necessarily individual relativism. It could be cultural relativism. And so, even then, there's this idea that we have to have this common vision if we're going to work together. It doesn't particularly matter what that vision is as long as we share it. It's kind of maybe a feeling that I might get from it.
Yeah, I don't know.
But one thing I won't. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the idea that you can sort of create your own heaven individually, or that you have to sort of have a shared vision once you're with other people there, brings to mind for me Hell and C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. I think at one point his son says, here, meaning heaven, is big enough for everybody to have their own private universe. And have you read The Great Divorce?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. So, the idea is that hell is kind of this dreary kind of world that it does have cities. Sometimes people live together because for whatever reason, that's what they want. But more often than not, people will sort of go, millions of miles away and build their own little castles with their minds because they are so disconnected from everybody and so unhappy interacting with other people.
But here that takes place in heaven.
Exactly. So it's so interesting to me that C.S. Lewis's vision of hell was Richard Matheson's vision of heaven.
Yeah, that is weird.
It is interesting. There seems to be a very mixed message in the film about love and connection, because I see that as central to the Christian message about redemption, and particularly eschatological redemption, is that it's very much connected with unity and love, and the opposite of what I think either Luther or Calvin talked about, which was this idea of sin is kind of like a nature curved in upon itself. But that's not really foreign to heaven in this particular vision. It's just it's there for some people and it's not for others.
Yeah, I know. In fact, the only place where connection seems to really take place is in or near that city, this common vision, which is apparent, which really only seems to be there to facilitate finding trackers to go find people in hell and to read books. I mean, in other words, it like you say, it didn't seem as though connectedness was really a central feature of this afterlife. It was something that was facilitated inadvertently in this common vision that was prepared for seemingly other reasons. I thought that was a little weird.
Yeah, well, and there is, so I have good things to, there's a comparison I'm going to make, and there are obvious contrasts. It's not a perfect comparison, but I think it's probably the case that Matheson, in writing this story, was thinking about myths like of Orpheus and Eurydice, of Orpheus sort of traveling to the underworld to rescue his wife and failing. But to me, this film, or Chris's character in particular, and maybe, I don't know, maybe this is intentional because his name is Chris, that he's a Christ figure in a way. So, there's this, it's a story about a man who's willing to risk it all to go through hell, literally, to redeem his bride. And, on the bare bones level, this is a Christian story in that sense, or, that particular detail. And I think it's also kind of interesting, and this could be completely unintentional, that he's doing it even in this universe where it's unclear if God even exists. And, if God's there at all. I mean, if he's there, he's distant. I think there's, Chris asks, who's his son, who doesn't realize his son, about, where's God in all this?
Yeah, and he says he's up there somewhere shouting down that he loves us, wondering why we can't hear him.
And then he says, "You think?" Like, as a, maybe you think that's what's happening. And so he's unsure about it. Well, maybe that's what's happening. That sounds nice, doesn't it? And so, but that kind of brings to mind the Christ suffering on the cross and him crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so, in particular, what it is that gets his wife out of there, he tries everything he can think to do to get her to go back to heaven with him and get out of hell. And finally, he just resigns himself to the fact that she's not going to leave. So he is willing to sort of let that hell envelop his own mind so that he can stay there with her. And that's when everything clicks for her. It's that act of love that changes her perspective. And I think she says, he says, I tried everything, nothing worked. And she says, until you tried joining me. And that very much to me sounds like the incarnation. I mean, this idea that it's this act of self-identification that is ultimately what secures redemption.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't know entirely how much of that was in Richard Matheson's mind, but it's certainly an interesting thing that I saw. But like I said, I mean, for him, that may have just been incidental. It could have just been his take on the Orpheus Eurydice myth. But in that sense, that's not necessarily a bad thing either from a Christian perspective. I mean, a story about romantic love is not foreign to the biblical, perspective. I mean, if you read the Song of Solomon or Paul's words about marriage in Ephesians 5, at the very least, it is a love that mimics Christ's self-giving love. And it even brings to mind what Paul said, that if he could, if his people, his ethnic, his Jewish brothers and sisters could be brought to Christ, he would be willing to go to hell.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. And actually, I'll take it a step further. There are some, I have not yet delved into their arguments, but there's some Christians who take Jesus' answer to the Sadducees' challenge differently than I think most of us do. The challenge that I'm referring to is where they talk about the woman whose first husband dies, and so she marries his brother, and then he dies, and so on and so forth. And they say, who in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And he says, you don't know the power of God. In the resurrection, women will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And most, I think, of us have taken that to mean that whatever uniqueness to marital bonds there is on this side of eternity, they'll be superseded by or exceeded by the closeness of relationship that everybody in eternity will share, so that there aren't, so for example, the unique relationship that I have with my wife would no longer be what it is now in eternity. But there are some Christians that I have heard explain that differently, and I haven't delved into it, so I don't know quite what they make of it. But I am a little intrigued by the possibility that that kind of love is in fact very valuable and may continue into eternity somehow. I don't know how that would be explained, or how that could be accounted for in that very challenge that the Sadducees give Jesus and his answer to them. But I do think it's worth considering that, as you said, at the very least, there is something valuable and powerful about romantic love. It's not wrong. It's not bad. And at the very least, it's a reflection of, like you said, the kind of love that Jesus has for his church, the kind of love that the triune, that the Godhead experienced in eternity, and so forth. And also another thing, just sort of related to that, if only loosely, that I found intriguing, was this idea that their pets apparently survive into the afterlife as well. And I've actually entertained the notion, what if animals will take part in the resurrection as well, and relationships between human beings and their loved animals might persist into eternity as well. I thought that was interesting. So I don't know, there's a lot to be explored.
Yeah. I think Lewis and C.S. Lewis also entertains that idea. I want to say it's in The Four Loves, maybe, where he basically says, well, maybe animals in general won't be resurrected, but perhaps there is a sense in which the animals that we are close to on the basis of their, entering into an intimate relationship with us, may partake in our immortality in some way, which is just an interesting idea. So do you want to? I thought it might be kind of interesting at this point to deal directly with the issues of what is heaven and what is hell presented in this film, and kind of how we see that as either helpful or very unhelpful, or very Christian or unchristian. So what are your, kind of overall feelings on that, or thoughts on that?
Well, it was moving emotionally, but in terms of, what is helpful for properly understanding heaven and hell from a biblical worldview, I'm not sure there's much there. There are little golden nuggets. So, for example, this stuck out to me, and I'm not exactly sure why, but if you recall, when Chris's daughter, in the form of this flight attendant, takes him to the city beyond the city, or onto the other side of the river that the city is on. They're walking down these stairs, and he says something to the effect of, "There's work." I like that, and that's one of these little gold nuggets where, Adam was created, and Eve was created. They were created to work the land. Labor, sort of intense labor, was a product of the fall, an effect of the fall. But work, qua work, if you will, seems to be a good thing. And I thought it was neat that, I think that character expresses something that we probably would experience too. Is that there's something valuable to accomplishing things in eternity. And so I do think that there will be a sense of work, and that sort of was a positive thing there. And like I've already mentioned, there may be some positive thoughts about the afterlife that we could explore when it comes to pets and relationships extending beyond the grave. But virtually everything else, this whole idea, for example, just as one example, of you creating your own world, that places you and your desires above just about anything else, including the reality as God has created it. One of the things that I've sort of wondered about is the possibility that in eternity we may be able to explore the cosmos and the depths of the oceans in a way that we can't now, because what prevents us from doing that are mortality and time. Mortality and technology. But if we have eternity to live and to develop technology, who knows? We might be able to explore the distant reaches of the cosmos and the depths of the oceans. And the reason why I bring this up is just to say that kind of imaginative vision of the afterlife, it reflects a value seen in reality as God has created it, that I don't think this vision of the afterlife exhibits.
No, yeah, but there's, you talk about the mishmash thing. The idea of work in heaven, maybe that's something he's taken from our wonderful Protestant work ethic. But there absolutely is a popular conception of heaven and hell in this film that I think he's kind of mid-rushing on. And, particularly the idea that we think of heaven and hell as either my highest joy or my greatest suffering or greatest sorrow. We talk about, oh, that was a living hell, or, oh man, that was just like heaven. And what we mean by that is, that was such a personal, private joy. This is my own little slice of heaven. It's this idea that heaven or hell is primarily how, in your mind, in some sense, it relates, there's this idea sometimes in popular culture that, hell is, whatever would be the most painful or terrifying for you personally to experience. And, I think that there's something of that in this film. And I don't see that very sort of subjective view of heaven and hell, in scripture at all, but it certainly is the popular conception.
Well, and that's exactly kind of the point I'm getting at, which is that the movie reinforces caricatures of heaven and hell that I think in a way that's not helpful for constructing a biblical worldview.
Now, here's the thought that I had, though. Is it possible that views of heaven and hell like this are just the necessary outcomes of living, growing up in a culture that holds to hell as eternal conscious torment? In that, maybe before I explain what I mean by that, it seems to me that, this is just one of many metaphorical ways of understanding hell, because the language of fire and torment is maybe too difficult, or maybe very evocative, and we think, oh well, what does this mean exactly? And so we try to take this literal language of fire or whatever, and we make it metaphorical, or it's popular in traditional circles to think of hell as not consisting of all the language the Bible actually uses to describe it, and say, well, really it's just separation from God, or it's that kind of thing, so I wonder if this is just kind of what is going to happen as people are trying to reflect on what this eternal conscious torment thing is supposed to mean or look like, or how can we understand it, or how can we make it palatable, or not sound sadistic. I don't know. I mean,
it does, and I think there might be something to that. And I would add that the other reason why this might be sort of the natural outcome of a culture that embraces the idea of eternal conscious torment and is trying to sort of come to grips with it and make sense of it. In addition to all of that, one of the consequences of the traditional view of hell is that the contrast between the two polar opposites of the afterlife is a contrast of quality of experience. Meaning hell is the place where you experience misery, and heaven is the place where you experience bliss. It's a combination of a combined focus on location and experience, so that this movie is very much a reflection of that taken to its extreme. The hell is the worst. It's a worst imaginable experience that you can imagine for yourself, and heaven is the most incredible experience you can imagine for yourself. And it has and both sides have very little to do with life and death. Whereas biblically, it's the other way around. Biblically, yes, bliss, joy, love, happiness, these things are experienced in in eternity by the redeemed, but the emphasis, to me, it seems this way anyway. The emphasis is much more on dying versus living, and so if that were the emphasis, then you wouldn't have an afterlife be a place where dead people remain forever, but a place where they can enjoy themselves. You would have, at most, a place where they go until they come back to life and experience life as created by God, versus the lost dying and not getting to experience life. So yes, I do think that the vision reflects the natural outcome, both of trying to make sense of eternal torment and also taking to the logical conclusion the emphases of the traditional view in contrast with the biblical view, if that makes any sense.
No, I think it does make sense. But what's interesting about this film, and I guess, or its depiction of heaven, is it's supposed to be this kind of, your own personal viewpoint of joy, which, in so many popular representations of what that heaven is supposed to be like, they all tend to sound very boring and hokey, and I don't know, a big yard where we could play football or whatever. But this film goes in the opposite direction in one sense, because heaven is essentially humanistic. It's about my own sense of fulfillment, but that fulfillment is still evasive, even in heaven. And so, God doesn't make everything right in this world. We're still on our own. Heaven may have less limitations for us than the earth does, but we're still kind of in the same boat we were in before.
Yes, very much so. So much so, in fact, that Chris and his wife decide, as many others apparently do, to be reincarnated. I mean, if the afterlife were perfect, why would you want to go back to an imperfect Earth? So it is very much. I mean, look, if the reason that Chris and his wife say they're apparently decide to be reincarnated is so they can experience this amazing experience of finding each other once again. Why couldn't that happen? If that really were what brought them ultimate joy, why couldn't that happen in their afterlife somehow? Why couldn't they each choose to forget one another and then re-find one another in their heavenly afterlife? So you're right. It does leave something to be desired, even if it's slightly better than earthly life.
Well, you brought up reincarnation, and it was tough for me to understand what purpose reincarnation actually served.
Exactly.
And it was very odd because it felt like it was just sort of him trying to put all these disparate threads and all these different religious viewpoints together. And, they do talk about the allure of falling in love all over again, and also of maybe not making the same mistakes again, or of getting it right, which sounds, very Hindu. But, I could spin that more positively and say, well, it's a kind of redemption that's like Christian redemption, and that, it's this rebirth or whatever. But the Christian rebirth doesn't require getting it all right. You don't, there's a sense in which you have died to what you were before, but you don't necessarily have to start your life all over again. There's a genuine redemption that happens. We become who we're meant to be in Christ because of what Christ has done, not because we're going to keep doing it until we manage to get it right.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so not only was that theologically not fulfilling, it didn't make a lot of sense to me why people did it. It was kind of explained, but it was unclear how it fit into this whole view of what heaven and hell are.
Yes, and it wasn't just reincarnation that seemed to make no sense. I mean, after all, there's no talk of. I mean, my understanding of reincarnation is that it's a way of approaching. It's a way of progressing toward nirvana. But in this world, there is no nirvana. The reincarnation is these two people do it so that they can experience falling in love with each other with each other again, which again I would think they could accomplish in the afterlife. So I'm not sure what point it serves. But it's not only reincarnation that's pointless. It seems to me that hell is pointless. At one point, I mean, you have in this hellish part of this afterlife, you have some suffering souls, but you've also got a lot of anger and violence and stuff like that. And so it's clearly there's some sense in which it's where the quote unquote bad people go. And yet at the same time, Cuba Gooding Jr., his character tells Chris that there's no judge, no crimes, no punishment. We're all equal. And it makes you wonder, well, wait a minute, if see, at least in eternal conscious torment, at least in the sophisticated defenses of eternal conscious torment, there's a reason for it, and that's justice. But here you don't even have that. Hell in this is the construct of their own making, and it's one from which they can't escape, except for Chris is escaping her from hell. It's a hell you can't escape from. It's not a hell that is deserved, imposed by a judge. And so then you begin to wonder, not only is it pointless, but what is the grounds for thinking that people have the capacity to go on consciously experiencing eternity if there's no God? If there's no God, why do they have this ability to keep on going on for eternity? And if there is a God, but hell isn't about justice and punishment, what in the world is it there for? Yeah. So you've got multiple pointless aspects to this worldview, it seems to me.
It's kind of depressing. I mean, it feels very Greek and almost like the view of Hades. And in fact, the tracker even captains like a ship, almost like he's going across the river Styx in order to bring Chris to hell to find his wife. And I think the language they use, annihilation isn't, hell isn't like this annihilation that's the consequence of being disconnected from God. who's the source of all life, but it's the consequences of, quote, your life gone wrong, end quote. I mean, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Why? So, for whatever reason, we are all eternal spirits, and we manage to get wrapped up in ourselves sometimes, and we, just have to deal with that somehow. It's a pretty miserable depiction of the afterlife.
It is, and why is it that the people that don't go to hell, but recognize they made mistakes in life, can choose to go back and live a life where they don't make those mistakes, but the people whose mistakes cross some arbitrary line such that it produces hell for them, they can't go back and live a better life? That doesn't. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Like you said, it's very bleak.
I don't know if it's just Annie. I don't remember if it's just Annie or if this was something that was said of the people in hell in general in the film. But it seems that they maybe are not aware that they're dead. So maybe it's just an intellectual issue that they have to get over that hurdle of accepting their death first, knowing that it's happened, and then maybe they could be in heaven or reincarnate. So yeah, it's unclear. I don't know. Well, but if you want to sort of make this a little bit more metaphorical in a sense, I mean, you could bring it back a little bit to the issue of Annie's pain or mental illness or whatever, and just sort of think about the fact that, that is what mental illness often is, or unhappiness in general. It's this kind of, condition that you're sort of stuck in, that your brain is sort of putting on you, that you can't seem to get out of. But I mean, I would certainly hope that a vision of, redemption or something would look better than that. There's really not, like I said, heaven is really just less limitations than earth. That's really the only difference.
Yeah.
And I'll mention at least one more thing. I don't know if you're familiar with who Werner Herzog is. Are you?
No.
Okay. He's a German filmmaker. He's done a lot of documentaries. He's also done other things as well, but he's kind of known for being very pessimistic. Very much. I mean, he talks like he's a German film director. So, but he actually has a very strange cameo in the film where he's in hell and he's talking to Robin Williams' character, and Robin Williams at first thinks he's his father.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was just a very, very, very odd little moment for those who are familiar with who Werner Herzog is. But yeah, so I think we've kind of gone over some of the major themes in the film. And do you have any closing thoughts about either theological analysis or simply just kind of how you felt overall watching the film? I mean, good things, bad things, whatever.
Well, I mean, like I said, I don't think it's a. I'm about to sneeze, by the way. Hold on. Well, if I sneeze, I'll start over and you can edit out or whatever, or just leave the sneeze in. I don't think it's helpful in almost any way nurturing and developing a biblical worldview. It was certainly moving, and it's thought-provoking for somebody that's watching it to have their thoughts provoked, like I think that you and I went into it doing. But I suppose it's valuable in as much as it does get you thinking about some of the kinds of things we've talked about. If hell is eternal torment and its modern defenders are right about the biblical language all being metaphorical for some sort of separation from God, I think you're right. I think that the emphases of this movie are the natural, logical conclusion to that kind of thinking. It's not about, as the Bible describes it, life and death. It's about real estate and the quality of experience in whichever side of the whichever neighborhood you land in. I don't think that's good, and also it strikes me, like I said before, I haven't. You know me. I didn't embrace this view for philosophical or emotional reasons, but it did strike me as I was watching this that the extreme amount of pain that Chris is going through in his afterlife, knowing that his wife is in torment, first torment in life, and then second torment in death. It just strikes me, even if in being glorified, we are given God's perspective. even God himself says he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Even if we were given God's perspective, it would still grieve us throughout eternity, it seems to me, knowing that our loved ones are experiencing torment. And I don't know how that's compatible with the biblical vision of eternity, which, as you said, is one in which God has wiped away every tear. So, I mean, these are examples and questions about philosophy of mind and questions about relativism. This is a really good movie for somebody who wants to think through these kinds of issues. It's not a really good movie for anyone who, isn't prepared to think about those and who is more likely simply going to have their worldview in part shaped by the presentation in this movie. Mm-hmm. I could see some people, for example, going in and be like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. Maybe heaven is a place where, we just get to construct whatever's most appealing to us. Yeah. So basically it gets to make them more narcissistic and selfish, so yeah, I don't think it's unhealthy for anybody going in unprepared, but for people that are, thinking critically about it as they're watching it, I think it's very thought provoking. And I think it's, for parents with, somewhat, teenage kids and want to discuss these kinds of topics, it might be a good springboard to having those kinds of conversations. So it does have some redeeming value. I just wouldn't. Its value is in the many things it gets wrong, not in anything that it gets right. Except, like I said, the work thing. What's that?
It's not necessarily a film you'd hand to an atheist and say, "Watch this and see what you think."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, actually trying to evangelize or something. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Well, and that raises a larger question about how Christians should be approaching not just film necessarily, but art in general. And I heard an Eastern Orthodox film critic basically say that because he came from a tradition that really appreciated what aesthetics could do, I think he had a somewhat dismal but also somewhat optimistic view of what film could be. That it could, if it was done properly, it could be used to glorify God and to, encourage communion with God. But that, but it was sort of like films ought to be like icons in a way. They are made with a theological purpose, and those films that aren't, maybe we should just stay away from, I think was kind of his perspective. Whereas, like you said, I don't know that I would just want to hand this to somebody without any context, but it is interesting to watch films like this because of the questions it raises, or for us when we're thinking about God or salvation or eschatology or the afterlife or personhood. I mean, love. I mean, so many of these things. I think we can develop sometimes a deeper view of something by contrasting it with something else. And certainly all of the great theology that's come out of the early church was developed in opposition to a heresy. And so, for that reason, I appreciate the opportunity to watch films like this, which I would say are heretical in a sense, but I can still appreciate what is either actually good or the good that can come out of reflecting on what isn't good.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And as far as the question of art, this is one of the things that I've lamented for some time, is that it strikes me that a lot of modern Christian art, whether we're talking about books or whether we're talking about movies or whether we're talking about music, is not of a very high quality. And I would like to see Christians make art that isn't necessarily theologically motivated, and that is art for art's sake. That's not to say that. I mean, I think that Christian artists should be careful about what sorts of inadvertent side effects their art might have. I mean, to take, for example, the thing that really struck me about this movie and about how it devalues the concept of objective reality. I wouldn't want a Christian. I would hope that a Christian wouldn't produce art that likewise glorifies relativism. But at the same time, I don't think that a Christian needs to even go as far as it kind of seems that C.S. Lewis did in Narnia. I like, for example, Lord of the Rings And although it does have some sort of subtle, theological resonation, it resonates in certain ways of biblical theology. Overall, it really has very little to do with it, and I like that. It's just a good story. It might provoke some thoughts. So I guess what I'm saying is just that I would like to see Christians produce more art for art's sake, and not simply try and copy the culture, but give better messages to them, because then you end up with, for example, 50 Shades of Grey, that series of books and the movies that are being made about them, prompted Christian filmmakers to make a movie, that counters that message, where a woman sort of falls for this guy who is celibate until, was going to remain celibate until they get married and stuff. And yeah, that's a good message, but the movie is simply a reaction to 50 Shades, and as a result, I've heard that its production value and its writing and all that is just absolutely horrid. So I want to see Christians take art more seriously, I guess.
Oh yeah. Well, going back to that Protestant work ethic thing, I mean, if you're an artist, your job is to create good art. And, the fact that you're Christian means that that's going to influence what it is that you're producing. But, if I'm going to hire a plumber, I don't particularly care too much whether he is orthodox in his theology. I care that he's a good plumber. Now, if he approaches his work with a Christian value of honesty and of not trying to cheat people, that absolutely, that's wonderful. But I think it's sometimes, sometimes Christian values relate to the work you're doing in a less explicit or direct way. And at the very least, if you're an artist, your job insofar as you are an artist is to produce good art.
Yeah.
And I think we've settled for, well, if you get the message right, it doesn't really matter if the art is good.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I once heard somebody say, I'll just piggyback on that with two thoughts, and then if you want to wrap things up, you're
Sure.
welcome to. But but I'm fine sticking around too either way. But the two things that I'm reminded of: number one, somebody once told me that the players of instruments in the temple, you can be darn certain that they were not amateur musicians like often get up on stage at church to play in the worship band. They would have been extremely good players of the shofar and of the lute and what other instruments were played in the temple. And there isn't any explicit or visible theology or content to the music that those instruments are playing. Those are being played by extremely high quality in the temple because that's their job. And because in so doing their job, they're bringing glory to God, and I think that's profound. But then also, you said I wouldn't really care so much if the plumber is a Christian. I'll take it a step further. If I need a heart transplant, and I've got a choice between a Christian who doesn't have the best of reputation medically, and an atheist, or even a pagan, a Muslim or a New Age person who has a stellar track record medically of saving lives and performing successful heart transplants, I'm going to go with that person. Work can be done for the sake of producing good work and doing it well, and without it having explicit, like you said, explicit theological content. So anyway,
well, yeah, and it is my opinion that this was a film that was made well. But I wish the theological content was a little bit better.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah,
and it certainly was emotional and moving, very touching, heart-wrenching movie for sure.
Chris, I really appreciate you doing this and coming here and the perspective that you brought. And I encourage everybody to look into you if they're interested in hearing more. Your podcast, The Apologetics, though it hasn't been in a while, is really awesome. There's a lot of discussion. We have great guests, and you discuss issues related to theology and apologetics. And obviously, Rethinking Hell is a tremendous resource as well. And there's also a podcast for it.
And books and conferences.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, do you have a couple website links you want to drop?
Well, as you've already said, theapologetics.com, that's the theo from the word theology plus the apologetics from apologetics.com, theapologetics.com. And yeah, I'm not keeping that going for the time being, but I do have all those past hundreds of, over 100 episodes up. And you're right, there's a lot of good conversations there. I would encourage people to check them out. And then rethinkinghell.com, rethinkinghellbooks.com if you want to get at a discount the 2 books that we published. rethinkinghellconference.com lists the details about our upcoming 4th annual Rethinking Hell conference, this time in Auckland, New Zealand. I will be one of the plenary speakers there, along with Glenn Peoples, who we've talked about briefly today, as well as Matthew Flanagan. So yeah, those are some links. If people want to get a hold of me personally, I don't know why they would with all the nonsense and rambling that I've done today, but if people want to get a hold of me personally, you can email me at chrisdate@rethinkinghell.com or find me on Facebook, facebook.com/chrisdate, twitter.com/datechris, although I don't use Twitter much. So yeah, those are a variety of links for people to get in touch with my ministries or with me personally.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.